Have you ever wondered why certain souls, those who sense deeper realities, are drawn toward the abyss of addiction as though guided by an invisible hand? Why does the path of awakening so often pass through shadow, compulsion, and suffering? What if addiction is not merely a failure of human will, but a cryptic language through which spirit attempts to communicate with those whose inner eye is beginning to open? In the esoteric vision of Helena Blavatsky, no event within the universe occurs without cause, and no suffering unfolds without purpose. What the superficial world labels as weakness, deviation, or moral collapse may, in truth, be the reverberation of a soul awakening too forcefully within a body not yet prepared to sustain enlightened consciousness. The tremor of addiction becomes the friction between the higher self and the enslaved ego, the sacred struggle between the divine spark and the shadows of Maya. What if reality is only a shadow of the eternal? What if the intoxication seeks not escape from pain, but reunion with the forgotten source? The human soul, veiled by incarnation, remembers dimly the boundless peace it once knew, and when it begins to awaken, the contrast between illusion and truth becomes unbearable. The personality, unable to comprehend this tension, seeks oblivion. In this confusion, addiction arises as a false portal to transcendence, an attempt to reach through matter into spirit by artificial means. Blavatsky taught that humanity lives entangled in Maya, the grand metaphysical illusion that convinces the senses that the transient is permanent and the finite is real. Under this illusion, the ego identifies itself with form, memory, and craving. Yet the awakened soul begins to perceive cracks in this illusion. It senses an emptiness behind the theatrical play of existence, a calling beyond the visible. Addiction appears where this realization overwhelms the fragile structure of the personality. Have you ever questioned who truly observes within you? The observer is not the addict, nor the craving mind, nor the trembling body. It is the silent witness, the higher self, the luminous consciousness veiled by incarnation. As this inner presence stirs, it dissolves the comfort of illusion. The ego resists, shuddering in fear of annihilation, and thus clings desperately to sensation, ritual, repetition, and intoxication. Is suffering not the echo of forgotten wisdom? In the Theosophical view, karma is not a mechanism of punishment, but of divine correction. Every chain forged must be unfastened, every illusion dismantled. Addiction becomes a karmic crucible, an initiation imposed not by external judgment, but by the soul's own demand for evolution. Through this ordeal, the individual is forced to confront the truth that no external substance can satisfy the hunger of the eternal. In the Akashic field, the subtle archive, where all experiences of the cosmos are recorded, the soul's journey toward self-realization is etched across time. Addiction emerges as a karmic echo, a distortion born from unresolved lessons and unconscious desire for transcendence. Yet even in distortion, Spirit whispered, even within chains, there exists a divine purpose guiding the soul back toward remembrance. The divine spark, that immortal flame within, seeks expression beyond matter. When its light intensifies through awakening, it destabilizes the rigid constructs of identity. The personality finds its old pleasures hollow, its narratives meaningless. In response, it seeks stronger sensations, deeper numbing, greater oblivion, not realizing it is reacting to the very awakening it unconsciously desired. What if the compulsion itself is not the enemy, but the battlefield? What if every relapse, every collapse, every moment of despair is not abandonment by God, but communication from the unseen realms, a coded invitation to abandon the false self and walk toward integration with the eternal? Addiction then becomes spirit's paradoxical dialogue with the soul. It is the scream of the ego when the higher self approaches. It is the rupture through which consciousness might escape the cage of illusion. The more intense the suffering, the more urgent the invitation to transcend identification with form. The awakened being feels torn between worlds, one anchored in the gravitational pull of matter, the other suspended beyond time. The soul wavers, confused, terrified, yet irresistibly drawn. This inner tension is sacred. This conflict is initiation. Through Maya, the soul learns discernment. Through karma, it learns responsibility. Through Akasha, it remembers its origin. And through the divine spark, It reclaims its sovereignty. Addiction, when read through the lens of theosophy, is not disgrace. It is an obscure threshold. What if the struggle is the sign? What if God speaks not only through peace, but through disruption, pressure, and collapse? What if those who suffer addiction are closer to awakening than those who remain comfortably asleep? The path is not condemnation, but comprehension. The awakened soul must listen beyond the noise of craving. In the silence that follows the storm, in the trembling moment of awareness, the divine whisper becomes clear. If this reflection resonates with your spirit, feel free to support this sacred journey by leaving a like, subscribing to this channel, and sharing your insight in the comment. Your presence helps keep this space of wisdom alive. Occult teaching of Blavatsky in the Theosophical vision articulated by Helena Petrovna, the human being is not a mere biological entity bound to instinct and impulse, but a multi-layered organism of consciousness journeying across immense cycles of evil. The phenomenon known as addiction, when stripped of its reductionist material explanations, reveals itself as an occult symptom of disequilibrium within the subtle bodies, a disturbance in the harmonic relation between the physical, astral, mental, and spiritual principle. The secret doctrine teaches that humanity progresses through vast rounds of evolutionary development, wherein consciousness slowly awakens to its own divine origin. Yet this awakening does not unfold gently. It disrupts, it fractures, it tears away the comforting illusion that once sustained the personality. Addiction, from this hidden perspective, emerges as a reactive distortion in the face of spiritual awakening poorly integrated. Blavatsky affirms that the soul's descent into matter is a necessary stage of its pilgrimage. However, the soul that begins to perceive its own imprisonment within form experiences a tension that the lower nature cannot endure. This tension manifests as craving, not merely for substances, but for oblivion, sensation, intensity, bypass, or escape. Yet what it truly seeks is transcendence. It seeks reunion with the eternal source from which it has long been separated. The astral body, the seat of emotion and desire, becomes inflamed under such pressures. It magnifies impulses, distorts perception, and pulls consciousness downward into repetition. Meanwhile, the higher self silently beckons upward. This internal conflict is not accidental. It is the very crucible through which consciousness is refined. Addiction thus becomes a battlefield between ascending spirit and resisting personality, a ritual of suffering that conceals an initiatory purpose. In Blavatsky's doctrine of reincarnation, unresolved karmic patterns follow the soul across lifetimes. The seeds of compulsion may have roots buried in forgotten incarnation, lives marked by unresolved desire, sensory excess, suppression of truth, or misuse of spiritual power. These seeds awaken in the present life as tendencies toward dependency, attachment, and self, but they arise not to condemn, but to be transmuted. The veil of illusion thickens when the ego mistakes the call of spirit for craving. Unable to comprehend the sacred unrest stirring within, the personality seeks solace in fleeting sensations, falsely believing that intensity is fulfillment. Yet each indulgence deepens the hunger, for it feeds the illusion rather than the source. This is the tragedy of addiction. The soul reaches for transcendence through a pathway that leads further into separation. Yet Blavatsky never presents suffering as meaning. Every ordeal, no matter how agonizing, is an opportunity for inner alchemy. Addiction becomes a symbolic representation of the soul's ignorance of its true nature. It reveals the false dominion of desire and exposes the fragile scaffolding of the ego, and in doing so, it offers the first glimpse of liberation. Universal Brotherhood, a central pillar of theosophy, declares that all beings are manifestations of one cosmic consciousness. Addiction isolates, fragmenting the individual from collective harmony. It convinces the sufferer of separateness, unworthiness, and abandonment. Yet paradoxically, it also illuminates the need for reconnection, the longing for unity, the soul's thirst for the one life beyond individual identity. The path of recovery, when seen through the esoteric lens, is not merely a cessation of behavior, but a spiritual reorientation. It demands the awakening of discernment, the recognition that the senses cannot deliver salvation. This awakening often occurs through profound collapse, when the ego's strategies of control and denial dissolve. Only then can the soul begin to hear the silent command of its higher self. In the voice of the silence, Blavatsky hints at the sacred solitude required for inner transformation. The aspirant must withdraw not from the world, but from illusion. Addiction forces such confrontation, stripping away false comfort, tearing open the illusion of self-sufficiency. It is within this vulnerability that the soul becomes receptive to authentic instruction. The mystic path is not one of comfort, but of awakening. The chain that binds must be recognized before it can be broken. Addiction becomes the mirror reflecting the soul's bondage, not merely to substance, but to identity, to form, to ignorance. In this recognition lies the beginning of liberation. For the seeker, the way forward is not repression, but awareness, not judgment, but observation. Theosophy teaches that evolution proceeds through conscious participation. To witness desire without identifying with it is to step beyond the illusion. To feel craving without obeying, it is to reclaim sovereignty. Thus, addiction becomes both a catastrophe and a catalyst. It marks the soul's confrontation with its own fragmentation. Yet it also opens the doorway to conscious evil. Through suffering, the illusion of control collapses, making space for higher wisdom to emerge. It is not the substance that enslaves, but the ignorance of one's true nature. The awakened soul must turn inward, listening to the silent voice beyond the noise of desire. In that stillness, the true path reveals itself not as escape, but as remembrance, not as punishment, but as purification. The occult lesson is clear. Within the shadow of addiction lies the seed of illumination. The chains become teachers. The fall becomes the ascent, and the suffering soul stands on the threshold of initiation, awaiting the courage to step beyond illusion and enter the higher law of conscious being. Initiatory awakening, when the soul finally perceives that no substance, no ritual of escape, no repetition of indulgence can quiet the primordial unrest within, a silent turn begins. This turning is not toward the world, but inward, toward the unbroken flame that has always waited beneath the layers of illusion. In this moment, addiction ceases to be merely a prison and becomes the threshold of initiation. Have you ever questioned who truly observes within you? Beyond the voice that craves, beyond the trembling of habit, there stands an unchanging presence, unbound by time or sensation. It is the higher self, the luminous principle that Blavatsky describes as the true being, the spiritual consciousness untouched by the storms of personality. To awaken is to shift allegiance from the transient mask to this eternal witness. The path of initiation demands sacred silence, not the silence of suppression, but the reverent stillness in which the soul listens to its own depth. In this inner hush, the compulsive rhythm loosens its hold, and a deeper rhythm emerges, the quiet pulse of the divine within. Self-observation becomes the first sacrament. To observe desire without judgment, to witness motivation without identification, is to dismantle the dominion of the ego. Addiction thrives where consciousness is fragmented. Awakening begins where awareness becomes whole. The seeker learns to stand within the storm without becoming the storm. Each impulse that arises is seen as a wave within Maya, a temporary distortion of the surface of being. And as the observer remains steady, the wave dissolves, revealing the calm beneath. Is suffering not the echo of forgotten wisdom? In the initiatory passage, suffering is transformed into insight. The pain that once oppressed becomes the teacher that guides. The very ache that sought oblivion now reveals the pathway to remembrance. Through sacred contemplation, the soul recognizes that its true nourishment is not intoxication, but illumination, not annihilation, but integration. Blavatsky teaches that the dissolution of the ego is not destruction, but liberation. As the personality loosens its grip on identity, the divine spark expands into conscious expression. The seeker learns that to forgive oneself is to realign with universal law. To renounce illusion is to reclaim sovereignty. The compulsions that once dictated existence are now understood as transient shadows, not ultimate truths. In this stage of awakening, the soul is called to discipline, not punishment, but sacred order. To walk the path of initiation is to choose presence over escape, clarity over illusion, reverence over indulgence. Sacred silence becomes nourishment. Meditation becomes communion. Awareness becomes sanctuary. The dissolution of the ego is gradual, gentle, yet relentless. It occurs not through force, but through understanding. The seeker begins to see through the veil of illusion, recognizing that every desire is a passing echo and every craving a fleeting distortion. Behind them all stands the unchanging source, the eternal witness who never thirsts, never hungers, never falls. In this revelation, addiction loses its identity as master and becomes merely a memory. The soul, once enslaved, now stands as pilgrim of truth. The path forward is illuminated not by denial, but by conscious alignment with the higher self. The more the seeker listens inwardly, the more the chains weaken. What if the struggle itself was always the call? What if the collapse was always the invitation? What if the descent was the very mechanism of ascent? The soul now understands that to awaken is not to flee the world, but to see beyond it. Not to escape suffering, but to transmute it into wisdom. The voice that once whispered through pain now speaks through clarity. The divine spark reveals itself as the guiding flame of remembrance. Initiation is not granted by outer authority, but by inner recognition. The seeker realizes that every breath is a sacrament, every thought a bridge, every silence a doorway. The higher self does not command it, invites, and the awakened being responds with devotion, awareness, and surrender. Through sacred silence, the false self dissolves. Through self-observation, illusion unravels. Through surrender, unity is restored. The journey is not toward something new, but toward what has always been, now standing at the threshold of inner integration. The soul understands that addiction was never abandonment, but the language of spirit urging remembrance. The shadow was never the enemy, but the teacher. The wound was never the end, but the opening. In this moment of recognition, the seeker steps fully into the path of conscious being, not as victim, but as initiate, not as fragment, but as eternal flame, not as seeker, but as remembrance itself. Share your insight in the comments. If this touched your soul, subscribe for more wisdom. May your inner fire awaken today.